Alright, I think I'm live. I hope I'm live. If I'm not live, that's really unfortunate. I started a little bit just before the hour here because I didn't know if this would work. So I didn't know if I was going to be speaking, and when Ruby posted about having a few slots left, maybe some in some kind of funny hours, and I thought, I'm in a different time zone, maybe I'll do one after all. I thought it was Wednesday. It turns out that was Thursday, and I had much less time to sort of put something together than I thought I would, so I was going to dive right into it because it turned out to be massive. I may end up having to cut off a bit of what I really did want to get to, but you know what, it's just going to be what it is. So I'm going to dive right in the interest of time. So hello there, my name is Mirinda Herbert. I am the Fear-Free Certified Animal Trainer and professional multi-species training member of the Pet Professional Guild, and certified trick dog instructor and title witness through Do More With Your Dog, among other things, but there's your basic summary of what I'm all about. So welcome to my presentation all about behavior production, or how to train any animal anything. That's my way of saying that yes, if an animal can plausibly or realistically do it, it is favorably likely that you can produce the behavior, thereby train it and condition it using the same applied principles of behavioral conditioning effective across all species, humans too. So word of warning, again, this is a pretty condensed crash course. I wasn't sure who my audience was going to be necessarily. I wanted to do an overview of many areas that are important in behavior production that I feel like you just can't jump into talking about producing behavior with much meaning without. So I have tried to keep this presentation meaningful to the topic that is behavior production, and some considerations you can make into producing behavior the way that you may want it. So we'll just have to see how fast I can talk and still breathe and see if we can get through all this. So, all right. So an initial note for all safety and ethics concerns: just because you can train something doesn't mean you should. In my personal opinion, which I'm going to talk more about my why in a second, the answer is most typically going to be, yeah, go for it. Train your animals, do that with them, teach them practical and cool behaviors, enjoy the process with them, and always give them the autonomy to consent. But there is a lot of reasons why you wouldn't or shouldn't train a behavior related to the individual circumstance and what you may have in mind. So training animals shouldn't be done at the risk of their or anyone else's health and safety. This is Linda Michaels' Hierarchy of Dog Needs. You can see hierarchyofdogneeds.com down there at the bottom. Wellness and Force-Free Behavior Modification Guide. This is great because, as you can see, training is quite at the top of the pyramid, or takes up a lot less space than these other levels below that have nothing to do with training or teaching you behavior necessarily. So those are important. Everything we could possibly discuss about training animals will fall wrapped up in ethical considerations, including health and safety and well-being, both physically as well as emotionally, and down to individual preferences. That's the animal or learner's personal preference, not yours or anyone else's preferences or opinion. That being said, here's actually a bit more about me and more so why I chose this topic to present. I love behavior production as a topic, as a creative outlet to coming up with or more precisely, literally producing complex and precision behaviors from animals, and of course putting those behaviors on cue. I am a self-certified training complex and precision behaviors geek, so this is really where it all comes together for me. In fact, my operating as or brand name is Ability Animals. That is meaningful to me, with a short mission statement of advocating for the abilities of animals through creative, positive reinforcement, skills training, and exhibition. I want to show the world what animals can do and what they're capable of, and get to kind of shove that in the face of people who might think or believe that animals have, in whatever way, less value. Perhaps change their mind or bring them around to some things that they weren't aware. Also, fun fact, I just want to completely selfishly get to train animals all day, all kinds of cool stuff, forever. So here's a snippet from my website with that sentiment front and center. You can see I've chosen here an image of a sled dog team currently up on my website. It's only one of the many images you can think of that might otherwise symbolize what animals can do and have done for us for so many years as humans. Well, for us humans. So supporting animals' place and continued place alongside us in the world is a big value of mine. I would never want to see our animals leave us or become extinct to our ways of life. So it's through this advocacy for what animals are capable of and what they can do with, in partnership with our help, that to me can help promote that they have value and are worthy of our respect and admiration for all kinds of reasons that they are. But people who they don't see that when they see just a dog or just a cat or whatever. But a cat who can do cool tricks, you know, people go, oh, they lose their minds. They might think it's down to the special individuals, when it's more of my intent to have that generalized to, nope, it's just what the animals can do given the right framework. It's quite a funny concept to me, actually, who sees all animal training as more or less the same, boiled down to the production of behavior, which here we are now full circle to the presentation here. So where does behavior production come in the grand scheme of animal handling, management, training, and care? Well, in a broader version of the humane hierarchy of dog needs, it falls where all animal training does, or rather should, ideally, after health has been addressed. Those invisible setting events, things that set the scene for any or all behavior for an individual that we can't work against and will not truly reliably or ethically address with training or even management if we don't know if an animal is suffering from some kind of medical or health issue. And then within management, that is setting the scene for a dog or animal to not be able to practice undesired behaviors, because what they practice they will get better at. I'll be talking more about reinforcement history being the backbone of strong, reliable, more predictable behaviors. We want more reinforcement history for behaviors we want, less for behaviors we don't want. So we can manage environments to prevent that, and especially when the behaviors are dangerous to the animals themselves or to others, and anytime it can really work against your attempts at training the opposite or incompatible behaviors. So once we manage our environments in such a way that these opportunities to build reinforcement histories diminish, that's where behavior production or training through producing behaviors we do want comes in. Part of the topic of behavior production is about producing behaviors we also want to then have controls on. Controls in this context are cues we condition to have meaning to elicit a behavior, so we can dictate more reliably when the behaviors we've taught will occur, i.e. more when we want them to or want to expect them to. I bring this up as cue introduction and controls is not going to be a huge detail here. I regret that I cannot talk about nearly everything I'd want to in an hour, so bear with me in this crash review. I put together some more of an overview of how behavior production ties in with animal training as a whole, and a bit more emphasis on using molding creatively to produce behavior. So I'm going to run through quite a bit of a crash course overview of some important elements you should know in the conversation about producing behavior. First, here, this slide, what is a behavior? The perspective you have here is actually not at all simple, necessarily. It can be vague, broadly generalized or conceptualized, or it can be needlessly specific, which is pretty much how I see the world myself. That being said, I have tried my best in this to keep things more accessible. The purpose of throwing up the slide with some ideas for anyone watching it is to offer some ideas of how the perspective on what a behavior is or could be, and therefore how it will affect what you think about or would plan for when you're looking at producing a behavior, how that's important, because it can change. So where is it relevant? Well, it's relevant, pardon me. Oh my goodness, where am I? Where am I? Here I am. All right, so where is it relevant? Well, it's relevant whenever you look at teaching a new behavior to an animal, one that they haven't done, whether that's transitional or specifically cued or contextually, has never happened before in time. Let's see how it depends on how you think of what a behavior is that you're trying to produce. So you teach a new behavior whenever you put something new on cue. Together, this procedure of events is its own behavior or its own expectation of behavior. You teach a new behavior when you want to change the meaning of cues to behavior or whatever may be prompting behavior in the environment. And that could be a behavior that's directly incompatible with one you don't want to happen. DRI standing for differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. I'm going to talk about reinforcement history next. Pardon me. So DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, replacing one behavior with another, not necessarily incompatible, but you have one in mind that you would rather have happen instead. And so overall, producing any new behavior is pretty relevant, whether you are looking at practical behaviors for pet owners, more complex behaviors, frivolous behaviors, maybe complex tricks, dog sports, etc. So reinforcement history, or what makes a strong behavior, the law of effect, that as early, or actually I believe earlier as a concept, maybe not named in such a way, but in 1898 Edward Thorndike posits that responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation become more likely to occur again in that situation, and responses that produce a discomforting effect become less likely to occur in that situation. So a response in this context is a behavioral response, and if in doing something, responding in such a way means good for that individual, that goes into a sort of good box of not bad. Maybe I can do that again for the same effect. And if it goes poorly, it's maybe not something that individual will want to try again. It didn't work out for them. And given many options to behavior, there are probably better ones in general. Certainly many learned over time. So the image of the two jars with coins going into them, this is symbolic of reinforcement history. It means if the two jars were different behaviors, every time that behavior produces a good effect, that can be like putting a coin in that jar. That gives that behavior a higher value and probability. So with the two jars shown here, if these were behaviors in time, you can see how the behavior on the right is a better bet for producing the pleasant effects. This is the probability, a grossly simplified probability of behavior, but it's a good symbol for what reinforcement history is. And at the bottom I put goal of DRI, DRA, DRO. That's goal of differential reinforcement, or reinforcing a behavior that's either incompatible, alternative, or even just any other behavior that isn't the behavior that would be on the jar on the left. So indicating the goal is to have this other, more favorable behavior outweigh the old one, so that it is more likely to occur in the situations where either behavior may. Quick disclaimer, these are all non-technical descriptions and definitions, by the way. They're just how I've put them in my own words to explain for the purpose of my topic here. And this is still largely a review for any of the animal trainers in the room, so to speak. I hope that anyone watching regardless will get some tidbit or another out of what I've put together as a whole. So moving on, that's reinforcement history. Okay, but what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is that pleasurable consequence in the law of effect, that coin being put into the jar that is a behavior that increases the probability of it happening again because it worked to gain something in some way. Reinforcement in this context of consequences is the whatever worked to affect the behavior that saw that increase in probability of the behavior happening in the future in some way. So the behavior was quite literally reinforced. If you think of reinforcements as having more people come to your aid to do something, say, or more supports going up for a roof, that is what reinforcing means in this context. And it's the behavior we're talking about reinforcing. So not the animal or the individual, just the behavior's likelihood of strength. Enter the quadrants. What are they? The quadrants is an inherently retroactive measuring framework because we're talking about something that either reinforced or alternatively punished or decreased a behavior as a consequence of that behavior. So whether a behavior was reinforced or not is not something we can know exactly until it's already happened and then measured in some way. So the quadrants follow the pattern of a genetics Punnett square, or at least that's how I recognize it, which is basically a visual display of looking at 4 different outcomes of combining 2 sets of something, which are then cross-combined to make 4 new combinations. It can be used mathematically for probability, though that's not the case in the behavior quadrants when you hear someone talk about these. It's really a hugely reaching concept of combining these 2 sets of whether or not something was added or removed and grossly simplifying the effect on behavior. It's a gross simplification because of all the variables of how behavior could be measured or affected, and it's taken as if these 2 sets definitively describe all of behavior and all we can do to affect behavior, which they don't, and while very powerful, isn't necessarily the case. There are 2 variables plucked to measure. They are 2 very brilliantly simple variables as a way of looking at effects on behavior, but in modern dog training use, it can be taken to quite the extremes as somehow a battleground with 4 corners to reject or defend. And by the way, now I think according to a post I saw Ruby make on the group, if you were drinking, now it's time to take a sip, as I mentioned the dreaded quadrants. I think if you're drinking for every time someone says, it depends, you should maybe reconsider your commitment. That's just not a good idea in any conversation about behavior or any life sciences. Of course, much of what does spark controversy related to quadrants is either ethics-based or simply not ethics considered at all for what we actually use the quadrants to try to do. But for the most part, dare I say, this is the kind of stuff I'd otherwise like to think is more, so to speak, common sense. I like these short descriptors as I have seen used by Kathy Sadeo in one of her webinars. And I think often about how driven by negative reinforcement, so that motivated from the threat of something, things like deadlines towards relief and liberation, humans are. How prevalent that is in modern society, and related things like workaholism, and really a key player in things like chronic anxieties, and how chronic anxiety becomes people's comfort zone because the anxiety is the driving force that ensures we get our next bit of or sense of relief. So it's a little ironic, but it works in tandem, and this anxious comfort zone is really just a reinforced pattern of behavior. You can see that in a lot of the self-help methodologies for people related to changing this and finding happiness and meaning in life by looking towards finding your positive reinforcement and working towards that to give you joy and satisfaction and motivation instead of running from things and with such fervor, perhaps too recognizing that what is being removed to provide relief isn't all such a bad thing anyway, a matter of perception. But that's just my train of thought on the human condition. But there's some emotional effects, or pretty straightforwardly what could be associated with the receipt of these consequences for behavior, certainly if ongoing. So I'm not going to talk in any more detail on what reinforcement is. It's a huge topic in itself with many routes you could take. Here I just threw up some keywords and things for interest if maybe you've heard of these things. But a final note and review, most importantly to always keep in mind, is that true reinforcement, what it is and how its value, will be specific to every individual learner, and that is up to them. It's either inherently, objectively effective, or it isn't. If it isn't effective, it isn't reinforcement. Reinforcement in these contexts is defined retroactively. So on to behavior protection. So what methods can we use to produce behavior? Well, typically you will see these topics or labels come up. Somehow a lot of the time in this order. I don't know why, it's just been what I've seen. But here are some keywords or topics or methods of behavior protection that float around, and in some ways they're debated or looked at in finer details individually, which is fine for looking at each individualized description, but they're not all on this short list actually different methods of producing behavior per se. It just doesn't make any sense to divide these topics up like that, or how I've personally seen it discussed somehow. Here are a couple less discussed perhaps, at least in the context of what we can do to produce behavior in teaching an animal. I put modeling in here, which is the physical manipulation of an animal by us typically as a less favorable means of producing behavior. I think it's completely reasonable to pretty much toss this one away in context for most trainers in teaching pets and animal behavior, unless the behavior is to be manipulated in some way and engage in that. Or unless you've considerately taught this method of producing new behaviors as a concept that the animals can comprehend, then to merge the way that they're being handled to create new behaviors separately. The way I see modeling being used is more so as an aversive, and I don't even mean more obviously as an aversive. So anytime you're pressuring an animal with your physical body or space to have them move, and they do it because they're avoiding you, this is coercion. I believe this happens subtly. Anytime you're expecting an animal to learn through being placed somewhere, for example, if you think this way, that you can teach them to go and be in a position, then you're probably just doing it. You're picking up the animal or placing their feet somewhere regardless of them not doing it on their own, because, well, that's just the way you think that you're teaching them. When that way of thinking takes away the animal's choice. So that's modeling. And this other definition of concept training is, again, my own. You might make yourself or have heard different distinctions of concept training depending. Concept training is almost like the return towards anthropomorphizing our animals in the positive way that posits the plausibility of much more shared intelligence with our animals than if we otherwise assume or don't test that these things can be learned. So it's very cutting edge stuff that's intentionally pushing this kind of paradigm envelope. So worth it to know about also, oh, my bad, I'm still here. Worth it to know about also, worth it to know that we are still discovering things and there's a lot of unknowns. And above all, never forget that if your learner isn't learning something, that's not on them and their comprehension to meet you. It's on you if you want to teach an animal something we know they can learn and can comprehend. It's on you to teach that successfully. Otherwise, you're just unsuccessful in teaching them the things we know that they can learn. Or maybe they can't, but either of those ways is not an excuse to then blame the learner. Is it something you can teach? Can you not teach it well enough? Or is this something they just can't learn regardless? You don't need to resort to or jump to other justifications such as, well, they just need a firmer hand in order to learn something or some such. Because it's not that. It's these very basic principles of conditioning applied, which either work or don't work as integrated into your approach. So with these methods of producing behavior, any method to producing or influencing an operant behavior to me looks something more like this, which is kind of a ridiculous diagram I've come up with just for this. So again, definitely not a definitive explanation to how these things all interact, but it is how I'm presenting it for the purpose of thinking of it all as interconnected and how there isn't just any one method or even approach better within one of these circles or another, in my opinion. At the end of the day, it's going to be more about whether or not you can effectively condition cue controls on a behavior that an animal can perform, and in what conditions or circumstances you have successfully generalized that behavior to fluency once the behavior has been produced in its basic form. I touch on positive reinforcement with all the methods. Keep force and fear-free in mind. Nothing is worth compulsion and force and fear-based approaches in managing a pet or animal's behavior when we can think of ways around it. Even if you were running from a wild animal, say, for your life, you don't actually want to create more or increase conflict. You want to get out of that situation protecting yourself, not projecting yourself as a bigger threat needlessly. there is a balance there that at the end of the day ideally keeps both individuals safe, as if they were unaffected by the other. With our animals, there's absolutely no need to cross these then boundaries. If you think of you as wanting to protect yourself, well, your animal wants to protect themselves, and so you should both have those acknowledged boundaries, and we don't need to be crossing over into their boundary of safety and well-being to do anything. Be proactive and flex your creative human intelligence, and just don't go that way. So I'm going to be touching now pretty briefly on everything shaping down or antecedent arrangement management up. And since these things are all interconnected, I'm not actually going to be talking about them as if all these circles here are all separate topics necessarily. I'm going to spend a bit more time on shaping and molding because of the value of molding in my own animal training and how I use it. But you can't talk about behavior production without these other things either, or even just molding alone. As you see, I consider these things as overlapping or integrated together in some way, usually. So shaping is how we get anywhere that looks somehow different from where we started. Shaping and molding used to kind of get muddled up in my head because if you think of either shaping or molding a ball of clay in art, these can mean the same thing. If behavior is the ball of clay, well, it's actually shaping what you'd be doing when you tweak the ball of clay and make it different with all these little adjustments, more and more until the ball of clay looks like something else you were going for through all your adjustments. This is shaping in animal training and behavior conditioning. It's taking the start of something like a lump of clay, if that was a behavior, and turning it into something else. Unless you wanted to make maybe a pancake and were very, very strong, you need to affect the ball of clay in multiple steps. So that's the same as shaping behavior. You affect a behavior in multiple steps towards the end goal. So that's actually the statue of David on the right, actually. And if you don't know, the statue of David was in fact carved from a single slab of material. So it wasn't shaped as you would manipulate a ball of clay. But you can see behavior either way, whether you are growing a behavior or whittling a bigger behavior down to more finer detail. Slicing is a rather well-known concept in dog and animal training, and it's relative to what can also be known as chunking. And the difference here is slicing is taking a behavior and teaching in these small approximations. So shaping the lump of clay in multiple steps. These steps could be known as slices. And it's not solely about breaking down the behavior or what you think is the behavior necessarily. It's also about separating and teasing out all these little elements from your learner's perspective that make a difference to whatever behavior they're doing. Popular considerations for what these differences could be are the 3 Ds, or distance, duration, and distraction. Meaning if you were to teach a sit-stay, to split these different perspectives or criteria, you would start by adding only one of these elements into shaping behavior that would be getting longer in duration, or further away from the handler, or with more distance, or distraction, or other things in the environment going on. But these things separately, and if you mash up all these different elements and expect to teach them all at once or overlapping too broadly, this is what would be known as chunking, where basically your slices are too large. Chunking as a teaching approach would be to say pretty much, whatever, my dog or the animal can do it, so I'm just going to expect that they can do it regardless of these other things. It can be our perspective to assume broad circumstances are all the same to our learner when they're really not, or they don't have to be. And if your learner does a behavior in one set of circumstances, any change from that circumstance, the position, the direction they're facing, the room they're in, the outfit you're wearing, can technically arguably be considered a different behavior. Even chronologically in time, when all kinds of things change within an individual, say, you could argue that these are all different behaviors, or what you're expecting is different. Whoop. So going back to my earlier slide on what is a behavior, it's valuable to in fact see anything you expect from your learner to know how and be able to do as distinct, so that you're not neglecting noting these subtle to more obvious changes, and instead always be teaching your learner, taking that position or attitude, and it's going to get you better results over time than not, or stopping teaching somewhere. And so moving forward from your slicing of all these different elements, you can see the colorful pie slices in the bottom right here. That's to show you once you've taught these slices individually, you can go about merging the smaller slices into bigger slices that then when all the different parts have been learned. And so you can see the colors. I've tried to sort of overlap them if you know color theory. So the blue gets overlapped with green and the yellow and so on in slices of their own. Following here, to continue narrowing in on the topic of behavior production, I may use examples and talk as if I am just speaking about producing this initial behavior, and I might call the rest proofing or generalizing. Remember though that any end goal or resulting behavior, if considered for all the elements exactly where and how you want the behavior to occur, however you define it, can still be all one complete behavior pie. That can be sliced up and broken down in all kinds of ways. So I don't want to have anyone confused by my showing just one half of the pie here. That's just related to what I've shown to make the distinction between when you're training to have a completed transition of or position of a behavior, that you would then go into training for distance, duration, distraction, things like that, adding on to the behavior. To produce those transitions and positions and new behaviors initially, or from scratch, so to speak, is what I think about when I'm talking about behavior, producing a new behavior. So for the purpose of producing solely an initial transition or position of behavior, this would be the whole pie, as if that is the end goal. So I'm going to run through some definitions in my own words to hopefully help anyone who is missing chunks of what I'm talking about understand what it all means coming together. So starting with the bottom up, for the most part, I'm going to be talking about my favorite means of producing new behavior in and around using molding, and some extra emphasis on the bridge part of affecting behaviors you're producing, if there's time. Because besides adding reinforcement as a consequence we know is responsible for affecting the behavior, exactly how is not to be overlooked. And as I have found and seen out in the wild, can be absolutely the difference between behaviors that are more blasé and behaviors that are really neat, tidy, and impressive. These can be the same behaviors with different qualities. It may just come down to how reinforcement is being delivered in the bridge. By the flow of how I want to explain it may give you some insight on why I view or conceptualize it as I put together in this diagram here. So pretty quickly, antecedent arrangements, management. Antecedents are things that precede a behavior, happen or exist before the behavior. So an antecedent arrangement, or intentionally arranging and manipulating antecedents, is just that. Management, or the way dog trainers will typically think about and mean when they talk about management, is setting up the environment to better dictate what behavior cannot happen in an environment. And I've put a star note to suggest that most behaviors, when we talk about managing them, are natural, or what would be natural behaviors, typically when we're not exerting effect over the animal or behavior in other ways. An example would be when we can't be there to watch a dog, to stop them from getting into the garbage in the kitchen. We can put a baby gate across the entrance to the kitchen, so the dog can stay in the living room where they can behave in all ways they would naturally or normally without other effects in that environment. Where if they were to do that in the kitchen when again nothing else was influencing that natural behavior, the way that might go down is less favorable in the kitchen with all the garbage to get into or whatever. So we prevent that from happening with management of the environment, that baby gate placement. Capturing, when you hear about it, like I said, these things are often talked about as a means of somehow producing a behavior, which are not actually all that different or distinct in practice. Capturing indicates manipulating antecedents that could be introducing new or alternative cues to behaviors that are naturally or occurring anyway, and then manipulating consequences. So through positive reinforcement, we can affect the naturally occurring behaviors by introducing this new behavior loop. So in this diagram of antecedent followed by behavior, oh, there it is. Diagram of antecedent followed by behavior followed by consequence. With capturing, we introduce new antecedents and favorable consequences if we are looking to reinforce that behavior, and so put controls on a behavior that's already happening, prompted some other way by the environment, and so on and so forth. But we don't technically have to do anything to influence that behavior to happen in the way that it occurs naturally. I put a star here that it may or may not be concerned with other intentional behavior production methods, and that may be true. It may be purely we wait around and we capture our opportunities to reinforce naturally occurring behavior. But it would be the wiser, more effective for volume of reinforcement, intentional decision to at least arrange to be ready to manipulate these surrounding antecedents and consequences. And while the behavior being produced may not truly need affecting from anything else, you could, in this kind of intentional setup, you could think of it as considerately producing the behavior. At least if you were introducing new antecedents, for example, putting these behaviors on cues, that's arguably now a new behavior you are working to produce more of and reinforce that behavior loop. Luring, so most people know about luring. Here I've written that it's the use of primary reinforcement to take advantage of natural motivation towards it, i.e. food in the hand. Dog follows the food in the hand with nose and thus can be positioned. Pretty easy way to get a dog to go where you want them to go. They're going to follow the food. They're going to follow the food readily when they also get the food. That's the big consequence effect of why they're following the food in the first place, because they're going to get it, or at least when the odds are in their favor. And most animals will do this naturally because any movement towards food increases their chances of eating it. That's pretty straightforward. Anytime an animal has ever gotten food in their life, it's because they have close distance between them and the food somewhat, somehow. It's pretty solid behavior, that. Now, following food in the hand is certainly something on its own. So to build that up may take a bit of trust and yes, reinforcement history so that they do get the food in your hand from your hand when they close the distance. Closing distance to food, pretty easy one. Closing distance to food in your hand, possibly very novel and suspect, and may require some trust building and reinforcement history for that. So luring can be a learned skill without primary reinforcement or anything in your hand. It can also be another object that, through pairing with reinforcement, as any other behavior they have learned works out for them. And through this or any kind of luring, it's used to merge the motion of following the lure to create new behaviors. Fading, removing prompts, cues, and other stimuli, anything that elicits the behavior with the goal of retaining the same behavior regardless of these absences. So with capturing, it's not so much the intentional fading of stimuli, then through your new antecedents to prompt the behavior and reinforcement of that loop, the behavior happening is less and less reliant solely on whatever that other environmental context was that elicited the behavior in the first place. So you build up a strong reinforcement history for your new antecedent or cue. And before you know it, you can ask your dog to go potty, not in the backyard, but in the house, and they will squat down and pee. True story. One example of a captured, naturally occurring behavior, wherever that may be, that you can put on a new cue. With luring, you're fading whatever it is you use to lure the motion until you can cue the motion in whatever way you intended to without luring, and the behavior will still happen, depending on what you want to then be the cue for the behavior. A lot of hand signals as cues come from using luring to produce the behavior. A hand coming up from your side to have the dog sit comes not too many steps away from a hand coming up from your side with a cookie in it to pass over the dog's head so the bum goes down and hits the floor. And molding, which is the use of props and physical objects in the environment intentionally to produce behavior. To fade is about removing those. So now I get to talk about molding, which is my favorite method to incorporate and consider right away when I think of producing a new behavior. Molding is, as I see it, kind of funny as an animal trainer's dirty little secret. It's not dirty and it's not so much a secret as it seems to go over a lot of people's heads when they see a really impressive, complicated trick that they just can't wrap their head around how it was trained or how it was produced. So it's not dirty. It can be very kind, actually, and ideal for errorless learning for an animal, which is what I'm going to talk more about in context here. It's not even little. What could be little? Well, it's not that it's not prevalent in animal training. What you use in molding could be quite large, and it's not a secret. So what do I mean by this? Well, it seems to be a secret more so to pet people and the general public who might see a really cool trick in the wild, so to speak. They might not be that involved with animals themselves, and they lose their minds. They're blown away. They don't know how you train that or trained what, species-wise. Cats are such big magnets for this because of that unfortunate reputation that they're somehow untrainable. And they don't know how the animal was most likely trained, being in those small, tiny steps of slices. And where molding is concerned, if they found out you used props, or if they saw you doing one of these previous steps or all of the previous steps, their result can kind of deflate, in their opinion. It's sort of as if they think you've cheated and it becomes less impressive. Or the opposite. It can be very impressive to see how molding can be used cleverly. So molding to me is the mother of all constructed multi-step with fading methods for over time and over multiple sessions, creating what can be some really fantastic and cool behaviors successfully. So molding is using physical props, physical space in the environment to produce behavior to happen, and towards any end goal without the use of these props. And so incorporating the process of removing these props while retaining the behavior, so fading reliance on these physical molds the behavior falls into. So molding is this trainer's dirty little secret, and slicing. Through molding, you can look at any behavior and come up with this artificially created balance between management, preventing undesired behavior, and capturing behavior that is naturally or more likely to occur, and slice the bejesus out of that and build on some really basic and then easy to produce behaviors, building on a strong reinforcement history for pieces of behavior, shaping, chaining, and or merging all these strong, very fluent little pieces into bigger, more complex behaviors. So I like to call it, at least the way I will do it, shaping in scaffolding, which is your mold, on steroids. So it is basically micro-slicing with props. The way I see molding is again through a balance of management, which simplifies for the purpose of my using it to explain, decreases the likelihood of wrong, quote-unquote, behavior or behavior you're not looking for, and capturing natural or increased likelihood of behavior through setting up your physical space molds to toy with this balance in favor of having an animal naturally produce the behavior steps that you're looking for. What should be natural or obvious to you if you are a forestry trainer is this is not about putting your animals in a corner or a box with only one way out. That would be coercion. And this should be obvious because anytime your animal engages with you cooperatively, as in when training and learning, this entire overarching setup should be choice and consent based. You need to have worked out an engagement and consent foundation to your training sessions. So I mentioned molding, and especially this way of molding being quite kind and perhaps even ideal for errorless learning. That is, in fact, the goal with molding this way as I use it. So you can see from the slide, I mentioned it is reinforcement history based, and as I've gone over, well, everything is reinforcement history based. Here I've put an emphasis on high volume of successful repetitions that promotes the ease of fading. So the high volume of repetitions to commit the behaviors to muscle memory promotes that it is then easy to remove physical molds and have the behavior still happen. It's the ease of being able to produce this high volume of reps that starts this process within your mold. So this is, again, not a secret in animal training. Molding is used a ton, but I wanted to try to present it in a way today that emphasizes its usefulness for success and how not to discount it, even if it seems a bit like cheating in some way, given the shaping and scaffolding on steroids, or a lot of scaffolding. In this case, it may seem too restrictive, like even though you're shaping and looking to raise criterion slices, or you can rise above. Well, that's not the way I think. And in my experience, in favor of molding your errorless learning geared complex behaviors, it's not necessary. So save yourself the headache and throw in props as management, decreasing the likelihood for those unwanted behaviors or versions of your criteria where you're not getting success. What can be taken for granted is that behavior alone has to be learned to perform. It has to be able to happen. And that's what I love about molding behavior. I want to make sure that it is quite fluent, it's able to be performed by the animals, and in that way it can be generalized in a way where it's not so much affected by the environment as it is the same behavior, the same motion, but the mold has changed. And with molding, you can practice these things and stay on them for a long time, as long as you need to, before changing criteria that you may also mold with new additions to your mold to make it somehow different. Something that can be really common in shaping, where shaping behavior is more freeform, is it may be structured so that you know what steps are in your criteria to progress to. But you'll see this with a lot of trainers and pet owners who are new to shaping. They think it's really cool and really empowering, this concept of building, that you can get stuck on a single step of criteria that by mistake you lingered on and you built too much of a reinforcement history for that, and now your learner doesn't or won't as easily progress to the next criteria that you're looking for or you're waiting for. So molding this way also removes this issue of lingering on any one step, because at any one step, that's whether you're fading an object or adding in another object, you're still balancing production of a likely behavior with managing that other errors won't happen as easily, if at all, ideally. So it can seem a lot like drilling a dog or an animal to do something over and over again, and there are certain considerations you want to make, and this goes across the board for boredom in your training sessions, but especially with some behavior repetitions, you might want putting a limit on them for the pure physical workout your dog or animal is getting, even working both sides of an animal in the same exercise, or at least being mindful of the physical strain any behavior you're teaching your animal or having them do is putting on them. I think that's a strikingly sad common thing for dog trainers and trick trainers and the like, that they can be guilty of glossing over. You just might not always think that about if an animal, an athletic animal can do something. You just don't think about it. But if you're getting a dog, say, to do a pretty physical behavior over and over and over again, you want to keep all that in mind especially, and be safe and be reasonable, and have breaks and pauses and things like that. And any high volume of fast repetitions is not to make your training sessions boring. In fact, I like that anytime I set up a session like this for a single target transition or behavior, my session can be awfully short. And with my dogs and my animals, I can't see that they mind too much, since if there's something set up for them to be successful in high volume of fast repetitions, that just means they're getting fast reinforcement, and for doing something that's quite literally made easy for them to do, or straightforward in some way that they understand. So relevant note. Don't be afraid to stretch out your behavior production plan over multiple small sessions. What I like about existence is that time is fair to everybody. It's not that some people or some animals don't have more or less time, sadly, but it is that time progresses the same no matter what you are doing or anyone else is doing. So no matter how you want to train an animal to do something, so long as you're doing it, time is on your side because it's progressing you forward all the time, so long as you're working on something. This comes relevant when you look at teaching behavior over many small sessions, with an extra high five and emphasis on rest. The cycle between being awake and training and sleeping, and allowing all the time in between sessions to have an effect on what you get together with your animal in the next session. It can be really surprising, so time is worth it. It's not a pat on the back to say that you don't have to rush. It's legitimately the better practice to make this intentional and incorporate it as part of the process. Time and rest is on your side. Some animals are better at generalizing than others, and they will surprise you when something they seem to be struggling with one session isn't such a big deal the next. That's a benefit you don't get if you just try to cram in a previous session that wasn't working so well. So what can be used for molding? Well, here are some more commonly known and used molds. Whether you know you're using molding or not, that is what it is. It's using props in physical space and objects to get the behavior that you want. When you talk about how it's easier to teach a stay on a platform, you can take this and apply it to how it's easier to do anything in such a mold where things are made really obvious. And remember, no matter what you were teaching behavior-wise, you still need to produce it. It still needs to happen no matter how you produce it. If you want that behavior done well and on cue, you need the behavior to happen, first and foremost. So not necessarily chronologically, but you can't draw blood from a stone, basically. You can't cue an animal to do something if they aren't physically able to do it. Never mind what you're asking or trying to produce. So platforms, control positions to stay on, to hold in. Platforms like this plank in the left photo with the dog act as a mold for a straight down. For example, practice heeling next to a wall where everything will be kept straight, including you. Keep your paws in one obvious spot and learn to be able to pivot your hind end. Target surfaces to fade, and I apologize as I was limited for time in picture gathering, so it may be kind of boring, but when you use a pad or a towel, say, to teach a dog to hop on and off, and you shape that into a rebound off your body, that's using a mold. When you teach a dog or a cat or any animal to foot stall by jumping first onto a small platform like a stool, and are then getting them to jump to it, literally performing the same behavior you need them to do a foot stall, they can do it because they've practiced it. Changing up the platform is not such a big deal. And side note, the platforms to the left are images of the Climb brand and Cato or Cato board brand. That's Climb, K-L-I-M-B, and Cato or Cato, C-A-T-O. There are a couple of popular options for animal training platforms. So what is not always considered to use in molding and producing more complex or neat behaviors? Well, rails, fences, anything guiding movement and direction when you don't just want to rely on cookies, tossing cookies, or you're in a great open area and you want to practice the performing of the behavior more precisely. Here in a photo is an example of, I'm actually using rails here as well to approach the skateboard, and a yoga block to narrow the space on the skateboard there so that my dog Flash only has reasonable space to at least start with one rear paw on the board. And that was easy to practice in successful repetitions, getting on the board and standing on with just the 3 paws that I wanted. He could have put all 4 paws on the board, knocked the block over, or even used it as a place to put his foot. You can use props that way as well. But it increased the likelihood of him just putting these 3 paws on the board, at least very initially, decreasing the likelihood of him just hopping on, because why not? He'd been on the board with all 4 paws before. What gives? So I just made this obvious and easy for both of us, him to get it right and me to mark the specific behavior I wanted, so I could put that specific behavior on cue and fade the block. Handheld barriers, things that move with you to guide relative position for your animal if that's relative to your position. Janice Gunn of TNT Kennels just released a video tutorial showing you how she used a handheld dowel in her healing side hand, and this moving channel, so to speak, at the side is the mold for maintaining straight relative position for the dog. And finally, using lots of props, a combination of all sorts of things that are intended to produce the behavior or make the behavior that you want specifically or precisely happen is not a bad thing. When your intention is to build up on a reinforcement history, put precise behaviors on cue, and build up all kind of complex and more precision behaviors. Extra benefit to teaching new and complicated behaviors through molding is on the way. You're teaching a ton of foundation behaviors on top of encouraging a lot of thought and consideration for your animal to work within your approach and within all the what could be considered sort of a distraction and a mess. I think it's kind of funny when I can imagine my dog under the impression that I'm just a terribly messy person and they have to go around all kinds of stuff to get to the target behavior. But it's that they do, and they get practice, and the reinforcement history is what it's built for. So a final note, which is important, I know I went through a ton of things, but that was made to be focused on the production of behavior. For anyone watching this, regardless of how much a review it's been for you perhaps, I want you to take on this piece specifically, because if you haven't or you don't give due consideration to what you do in your behavior bridge to affect the behavior you are trying to produce and get from your animal, do. Start. Start now, do it more. Give it more consideration and thought. Changing this difference alone changed how I train animals forever, and I'm now constantly experimenting with new reinforcement strategies and analyzing, chopping down, and chopping up parts of my process that I could change or basically optimize for my behaviors. So a bridge is what you might call using a clicker or a marker word, but it's not quite that simple. It's not the image of a bridge to bridge, where you have your desired behavior on one side of a river, say, and your reinforcement or your reinforcement delivery on the other. No. A behavior happens in or on this bridge, and this affects not only your behavior as a consequence to other behavior, your bridge is also part of the behavior preceding the reinforcement that is being reinforced in itself. So, you saw this diagram, this behavior loop in my slide on capturing, where I use it to discriminate between the antecedents you would be affecting, so the cues you were introducing before the behavior that was going to happen anyway, and then you reinforce that part of the loop with a consequence, building the strength of that association and the behavior. And most of you watching in on this, I reckon, will know what a clicker is or what a marker word is. It's when you use a click or some other kind of signal that is taught to bridge the desired behaviors, the ones you want to reinforce, with the actual reinforcement, as there is likely going to be time in between, and so you use it to, as clarity of communication, so your animal knows or keeps in mind that in order to get the reinforcement, they need to be driven towards that which they were doing in the instance that made the click or marker happen, because that's then follow up with the reinforcement. And reinforcement might not simply happen otherwise, so it's that click that they're working towards. Well, the click or mark is still just a moment in time in itself, and it bridges the comprehension of the behavior prior to the click to the meaning of acquiring the reinforcement, but that is also just potentially considered one moment in time. So the behavior between these 2 points, the behavior in or on the bridge, if you will, as we know, behavior that happens prior to the consequence of reinforcement is reinforced. This is also going on, whatever is happening before the actual acquisition of the reinforcement, whatever part of what happens next that truly does act to reinforce the behavior or behaviors. So it's actually 2 behaviors, sort of a 2-step process a dog or animal is driven towards in this type of pattern. First, they need to acquire the click, because that's like unlocking the first door. They need to actually get to that part they are then expecting to acquire what they want, what it is they're ultimately working for. And with a condition click or marker word in this way, they should know that they are getting something. So it's not just happening randomly. That is why they do work for the click and not just to access the reinforcer in some other way. They understand the game, the pattern of it. So all that in between, the way it affects behavior prior to consequence is as much part of a new behavior that is being reinforced. And so note here that if you're making this pattern all blurry for your learner, you are taking away from your goal behavior that is to happen before the click. Work towards that first, always. Separate the 2 in your mind and in your actions, but know that what happens after the click is part of what your learner is working towards and is too being reinforced. So what should you do to affect your goal behavior favorably? Well, how much arousal in your animal do you want them to take into the process of working for that click in expectation of what's to come? What direction do you want your learner to be patterning in as compelled to reflect some inclination of going in that direction of reinforcement acquisition into the goal behavior before the click? Especially combined with higher levels of arousal, that speed of get it all done. What the value of any reinforcement will be will depend on your learner. If you're aware of these preferences, you can use that to affect whichever behavior you're teaching. What are inherent properties to the reinforcement process? Is it a toy that they chase, grab, and shake? Or is it a scent to use their nose in a way that is reinforcing to them and influences that kind or level of consideration into whatever behavior they need to do to obtain the rest of the pattern? Okay, so that is finally it. Thank you all for tuning in. I can't believe I got through all of that in time, actually, with time to spare. Thank you all so much for tuning in. So a quick plug here, I'm starting a new Facebook group project that is multi-species animal training support and feedback group, given the framework of working towards trig titles. So all about behavior production for the love of animal training and the love of the process, spending time with your animals and achieving together. And just shortly in the next week or so, I'm opening it up, accepting all join requests and diving in for lives and tutorials and whatnot, feedback and troubleshooting with folk who may be working on their novice trig title. To start. But the group is made to be for all animals and species training through creative production of behavior and all these things I've talked about, which is just totally my jam. So if you want to join, please do. Keep me company, geek out together. I'll put the link to the Facebook group somewhere else too, related to this post in the comments, I guess. But there's the URL. So thanks everyone so much again. Thanks to Ruby, the organizer, for bringing us all together to go totally crazy like I did with our shared love of fear and force-free dog and animal training. We are an intense group, but you can see throughout all the presentations how much value we are together, more than even the sum of our parts, for all the kinds of applications we bring to the table. So thank you all, and cheers. If there is any comments, pre-disclaimer, later disclaimer, consequence disclaimer, I actually can't see if this is even working right now. I hope it did. But if there's been any comments live, I apologize. I haven't been able to even see them as they may have come in, if this did work. But after I stop the share right now, I'm going to look in and I'm going to give some time there. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.